Welcome to Vermont Artists and Authors, where we interview great storytellers and artists from the amazing Green Mountain State. This is episode 23. I'm your host, Barney Smith of storycomic.com, and we're excited to have with us the acclaimed author, Simki Kuznick. Simki, thank you for coming.
Oh, thank you for having me.
You're welcome. And so you're here to talk about inspiring and timely book that is Paul Murray's Revolutionary Life. This is your first long prose published book, correct?
Yes.
You've had a lot of published works in poetry, but this being the first one. Talk to us first kind of about your inspiration. So because you discovered Pauli Murray, you said back in 1972 when you were working overseas, correct?
No, it's just that so it just started because I met a guy named Bartolome Ruzev, who's African American from New Orleans of Creole heritage, but he was a regional coordinator for Operation Crossroads Africa, which was a summer program for students to go to West Africa and help. We built bricks to make a school. And that program was actually a model for the Peace Corps, because the pastor James Robinson, President Kennedy actually used him as an advisor to do the Peace Corps. Wow. And it was a way to bring people together. I don't know that we did that much to build the school, but we had a lot of interactions with each other, and that was great. And I just made friends with Bart, and then I went on to marry a man from Eritrea, and we had two lovely children. And we lived in California at the time, and we joined a group called Interracial Pride to support interracial Black-white families with biracial children. And so Bart he knew that I was interested in interracial families, and then he gave me this book, Proud Shoes, written by Pauli Murray in about 1956. And it's a story of her very mixed background, her ancestors in America, a truly American story. And she had written it because she was trying to get a job. She was refused because of her past associations. And she had references from Eleanor Roosevelt, who had become a friend, and Thurgood Marshall, and J. Philip Randolph, who had done a march on Washington. So she, but even these people, she had once been a secretary at a tourist agency that took trips to Russia. So that was, considered communist. So there was a little of that. But anyway, she was very incensed and said, well, I need to tell people about my roots, my past associations. And so she wrote a book about her family, and she lived with her grandmother and grandfather because her parents had died, and she lived with her aunt, actually, or all three of them. And so she knew her grandfather. And on his side of the family, he was from Pennsylvania. And this is like, the family goes back to the 18th century. So her great-grandfather had been freed by a Quaker, probably when he was maybe 20, and he never told the family that he had been a slave. She had to find out that in a census because he was ashamed of it, but because he felt himself he was a free man of color. And he married a woman of a French family in Delaware. And so he had been hired as a hired man in the family, and she ran off. They eloped together, and they worked hard. And for 20 years, they made $1,600 and were able to buy a farm. Wow. And they'd been farming all during this time. And then the son, Pauli's grandfather, fought in the Civil War. Then after the war, the family, they were brick makers, and they brought the business down to Durham, North Carolina, because grandfather met his wife, who had a completely different story, which was that her mother was a Cherokee woman who was enslaved in a very prominent family. It was two brothers and a sister, none of them married. And their father had been a congressman in President Monroe's time, and they gave money to found the University of North Carolina, which figures later in Pauli's life. Her great grandmother was raped by one of the brothers and had her grandmother Cornelia. And then the other brother took her away from that brother and had 3 more children. But there were 4 girls, and the spinster sister took them into the house to, raise them as, well, they were her servants. And she used to take them to the church, and they would sit up in the pews for the, so that's the story of, and I think she gave a little bit of land to Cornelia, the grandmother, or I guess once they were married, so I was inspired to, Pauli Murray tells about all her escapades and accomplishments and firsts that she does. But it's, it's a little dry, and I wanted to write a story because she has so many adventures that would, inspire young people and kind of bring the more adventurous parts of her life together. And so that's why I wrote.
And so Proud Shoes was written. How is that compared to the other memoir, that The Song in a Weary Throat?
Well, that one just describes how she was researching, and she tells the story of her ancestors. And doesn't talk about her own life at all. So the memoir, Song in a Weary Throat, is really her autobiography.
For those that kind of follow Pauli Murray's life, what are some of the things that you kind of introduced to people that know about Pauli Murray in this young adult novel memoir?
Well, this book is different, from there. There's a documentary on her now, right, by the women who did RBG about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and that's actually how they learned about Pauli Murray, because Ruth Ginsburg credited Pauli Murray for a briefing about equal rights for women being in the 14th Amendment. A lot of books go into her life, but don't really include the ancestors. And then she rode the rails train like a hobo one time. So people just sort of mention that, but they don't dramatize it. So that's kind of what I did in my book. That's a little different. And actually, you talk about people who follow Pauli Murray. But when I was writing the book and trying to get it published, really about 10 years ago, I would give it to editors, some African-American editors, even at, good publishing houses, said, wow, this is really an interesting story, but no one's ever heard of her. So I couldn't get it published. And so just recently gave it to Rootstock Publishing. I pitched it, and it's a nice, small, independent publisher in Vermont, which you know about. And so Stephen Mitchell said, oh, my wife knows about Pauli Murray because she's a feminist from way back, and she knew that Pauli Murray helped found the National Organization for Women. Just one little sidelight that Pauli Murray did. So I was happy. I'm very happy to be with Rootstock.
Right.
But meanwhile, in the time that the 10 or so years that where I kind of put the book away and figured, well, we'll try again later or something. Academics were writing books about Pauli Murray. They had access to her papers at Radcliffe, and she used to save everything. All her papers, and even though she lived in tiny apartments, she would always have boxes and boxes of her letters, and she always said one person and a typewriter can start a movement. So she was always writing letters. She even wrote President Nixon a letter nominating herself for Supreme Court Justice one time. So, like I say, now is her time. She would have been up there nominated for Supreme Court Justice, I think, if she was.
Why would there be some reasons why nobody has heard of her if she's been ahead of her time for so many things?
Well, we think it's partly because, so as I was saying, her papers talked about more her love affairs and, private letters. And so she was a lesbian, but she, like, her memoir never spoke of that. She said she had girlfriends that acknowledged them, but she didn't talk about them being lovers. And so I basically, when I first wrote the book, just used her memoirs, the two books, as my source. And then when I discovered all this new information about her gender issues and, flexibility, and I put that into the book, and that's what kind of gives her a timeliness now, because she is a person who's so intersectional, being a Black woman, and also a lesbian, and also transgender person. So she really wanted to be a man. She felt like she inside was a man, was a man. And so I added those things. I was going to, maybe the couple of things I thought I might read are kind of stories when she was young, how she used to dress. You can see how she's dressed in this outfit on the cover. That is a photo that she gave to Eleanor Roosevelt. On the back of it, she says, "This is me. This is how I want, I see myself as a healthy, happy person." And that's kind of the way she dressed most of the time. Although not when she was working, she had prim, proper dresses.
So did you want to read an excerpt?
Yeah. So she was very adventurous, liked the outdoors, and she would go hiking in the 30s with her girlfriend. So this is a story about one of their trips. So life during her college years wasn't all work and no play. Pauli liked to get out of the city when she could, and often hitchhiked with friends to save money. In March of 1931, Pauli and her friend Dorothy Hayden, whom she affectionately nicknamed Tony, hitchhiked to Newport, Rhode Island, where Tony's family lived. For safety, they wore Boy Scout uniforms and practiced speaking in a low register as they bantered back and forth like regular chums. After an uneventful ride with a traveling salesman, they were let off at the train station in Bridgeport, Connecticut, where they planned to use the restrooms. At that time, members of the Travelers' Aid Society might be strolling through the station to help stranded travelers, but they also kept an eye out for vagrants or people engaging in questionable activity. That afternoon, one of them saw a young Boy Scout enter the women's bathroom. When Tony walked out, the Travelers' Aid officer confronted her. "Young man, may I ask why you're coming out of the ladies' room?" "Me?" Tony looked around in amusement. "Why, it could be because I'm a girl, and I have every right to use the ladies' room." "But you're dressed like a Boy Scout," the woman insisted. "Oh, you mean this?" Tony looked down at her khaki pants and waved her olive green necktie. "I always wear a Boy Scout uniform when I travel." She leaned forward and whispered conspiratorially, "Keeps the young men away from me, The woman continued to press her. "Are you traveling alone?" "Well," Tony began, but then the woman's gaze rested on the door of the men's room, from which a second Boy Scout emerged. "I see you are not alone," the woman uttered in horror. She now thought she was confronting two underage lovers on their way to elopement, or worse. She immediately called a policeman over. Pauli realized she would have to confess. "Officer, ma'am," she added respectfully, tipping her scout hat unconsciously. "We weren't trying to fool anyone. We were only having some fun. We're just a couple of girls working on an article for our college newspaper." They ended up spending the night at the Bridgeport protective home arranged by the Travelers' Aid officer. In the morning, they had a hearty breakfast of pancakes and bacon and proceeded on their way. Pauli kept a scrapbook of her road trips, which she titled Vagabondia. Their escapade was written up in the Bridgeport newspaper, the story headlined, "Slip Brings Halt to Tour of Two Girls." In her scrapbook, next to the news item, Pauli pasted another story about a girl who always dressed like a boy, whose mother did not discourage her. Pauli must have been reminded of her aunt, who had indulged her childhood desire to wear boys' clothes as well. To prove the point, she pasted a photo of herself sitting on a ledge in sporty white slacks with turned-up cuffs, holding a white fedora hat. She titled the photo, "The Dude, 1931."
Because as you were saying earlier, this was kind of a work in progress for a lot of years for you.
Mm-hmm.
Were you always going to make it a YA novel, a young adult novel? Or was that something that evolved into deciding to make it into a young adult novel?
I think it was my intention,
Okay.
but I think it's for anyone to read. So, and it's funny because some people or some, I think, oh well, my Kirkus review actually was featured in their monthly newsletter. So I got a nice review, but also they featured it, and they didn't put it in the young adult section. They put it under indie books. So it's kind of up to whoever reads it. But someone else said, well, my aunt was the first reader, and she was the one actually said, you've got a lot about women here. Are you sure she wasn't a lesbian and you should be talking about that more? And so later I did, but this time when she read it again, she said, gosh, I just wanted to learn more about her. And and one of my blurbs said that it was like a primer to introduce you to Pauli Murray, but there's a lot more to know. You can't write it all kind of in one book, and not a sort of a dramatic book like this. It would have been too long.
Right. How much did you have to kind of trim out and cut out? Was there a lot of stories that you kind of wish you put in that, maybe your beta readers or the editors like, it's getting too thick? So
no, I just kind of tried to take the most dramatic stories. Now, she actually was married for a month or so. It didn't work out very well. And I could have gone into that, but I thought she doesn't talk about that very much and wasn't really proud of that episode in her life. So I just dropped, I didn't write about that.
Okay.
There's a lot about how she's doing research. That's not very dramatic. So I didn't, or how she wrote all those briefs and, but the fact that when she was at Howard, you can go into some of the first, she was, one of about 4 women at Howard Law School. And how she got in, she was working, she did a lot of work as an activist, in the 30s. And she was trying to raise money for a man named Odell Waller, who was up for murder of he was a black man in the South who was accused of murdering. Well, he did kill the owner of the land he was sharecropping, and the man was trying to steal his crops or the land, and they had an altercation. And so she was trying to raise money for his defense. And Thurgood Marshall was in one of the halls where she was talking, and he took her aside afterwards, said, well, your arguments are so good, you should apply to law school. And so she, or come to Howard, basically, where he taught. So that's how she got to go to Howard.
So talking about putting on like your author hat for a second, what were some of the challenges or differences that you noticed between when you sit down and write your poetry as compared to writing prose?
Well, poetry has to just come out from inside of you, I think, where you have an observation, and it's using the most spare language that you can. And so I think my transition to writing this book was more about trying to write a sort of a coming of age novel. And I failed at that. I never was really able to either achieve enough objectivity to figure out or where to go in on the story. And I just was too close to the material, I think, to make it resonate for a larger audience. So this was a way to actually, in a way, to practice writing about something that was just outside of me. The plot was always there. I'm not that great at making things up. So I guess I like the genre of a biography. And so it wasn't that hard. It's funny. I was working, I was getting actually my undergraduate degree and my MFA about, I went on. So this was all while I was working. I used to do 2 classes a semester, or 2 nights a week for years. It takes a long time. And I was saying, well, how did I ever find the time to write this? Like, I just like, and I was looking through my files recently. I'm retired now, can do that. And I found a binder, just a school type binder or notebook with lined paper. And what I did was I would just take a chapter and I would just rewrite it with dialogue and action. And, so there's a lot in there. When she would make an observation, I would put that into dialogue and find a way to make a scene out of it. So that was my process.
What were some of the skills you had from being a poet, from writing poetry, that translated easily for you to writing, that you said, oh, I'm glad I knew how to do this ahead of time?
Yeah, I think with poetry, I'm very sensitive to rhythm.
Okay.
And how the words really sound as they're read aloud. And I'll rewrite a sentence that's perfectly factual, but if the rhythm isn't there, I'm going to change the words because I want it to sound like real speech, or that if I'm reading it aloud, I'm especially with poetry, I'm very strict about the grammar. I'm not one of those free verse types, where everything's kind of chopped up. If there needs to be a comma and I want you to pause there, I'm going to put a comma in. But a lot of times I put commas in just because I want to pause. It's not really for the grammar of it. Even little things that they don't really tell you in writing class, I don't think, that in dialogue, when someone's pausing, that's when you put in a little bit about, she flipped her hair or something, because that just putting that little part in is a pause in reality, so that each part of the sentence or phrases are divided. And, that's just a little trick of writing, I guess.
Right. What would be your advice for people who say, hey, you know what, Simki, I got a book. I got a book together. What do I do with it? Did you, recommend self-publishing, looking for an agent, or going into like a hybrid house, kind of like what Rootstock is? What would be your suggestions for those that wrote something up already?
It doesn't hurt to try to get with the bigger publishers and just query them. But I felt, and probably if I had a little money to pay for it, so, maybe you could even do a GoFundMe to pay for hybrid publishing. But I don't feel there's anything wrong with putting a little bit of your own money into it, because just the way the book publishing business goes now,
Right.
I think it's okay to sort of figure out a hybrid way to publish your work. And you've just got to, I don't know, if it's meant to go there, then it will. But the thing is, I think it's much better now that this book came out now than if I had done it before, because
Right.
people are aware of Pauli Murray.
Right.
This book just got picked up, and I'm sure Samantha Colbert of Rootstock, she sends out e-blasts to booksellers and everything, but I noticed it was picked up by the Journal of Blacks in Higher Education as a notable book to read. And, it's right up there with a book about W.E.B. Du Bois. And, I just don't know if that would have happened 10 years ago.
Right. From the first chapter, as you first started writing it, how long was this process take to put together this book?
Well, like I said, I don't exactly remember. And, for me, it was just, if I had time, I would just do another chapter, and then my favorite part, and then it was in longhand, so then I would type it up. And then my favorite part is the editing, since I'm an editor. To me, it's really hard to, get that initial, and it's always really bad. It doesn't sound right at all. But then when you put it in typeset form, it starts to look a little better, and then it's just a matter of editing. And so that's kind of my process. So I did those one at a time. There's about 20 chapters in there. So it probably took me 2 years, maybe.
This is something that you've wanted to write for a long time.
Well, I used to say, I was raising kids. I could never have more than one extracurricular activity at a time. And so I was going to night school when I met my future husband, and I gave it up for 2 years because he was my extracurricular activity for a couple of years.
Would that be something that you would recommend to authors and writers too, as well as to do the editing?
Well, that depends how confident you are about your actual verbal abilities, I think. But I've always been a good writer and an editor, so I didn't read that. In fact, I was amazed hearing about other people's stories that, Rootstock hardly did any editing, except I do have a story about that. Since I'm a white woman writing about a Black queer woman, the first editor they recommended, and because they recommended a copy edit, of course, and she didn't want to do it because she, as a white woman, she didn't feel qualified to write a book about a Black queer woman. I looked for other editors, but Rootstock, Stephen Mitchell found a very good editor named Sima Stubblefield. And she did we couldn't figure out if it was a developmental editing or copy editing, but anyway, it was actually sensitivity editing.
Okay.
Had to put the language up to date. I can read a little. There's one of my favorite passages. So this is about the great grandmother, the French woman. And
okay.
So she's farming, and they live in a mixed community. She has a white neighbor, and she's white, and her husband's Black. And so he comes by, grandfather, and Pauli's family would tell these stories. So the family kept a sense of these, kind of the way their ancestors talked and told stories. So they were handed down through the family. And so she says, Grandfather Robert told a story about a white neighbor coming over one day and saying, "Ain't Sari," her name was Sarah, "has any of those no accounts round here been stealing your chickens or your pigs lately? If they have, just let us know and we'll take care of them for you." Miss Sarah looked up from weeding the garden and said, "Yes, Uncle, to tell the truth, some of my chickens have been missing. The only trouble is, I don't know whether it's white no accounts or Black no accounts that's been taking them." So.
Wow.
And she would say, we're all betwixt and between, getting it from both sides of the fence. And she says, she told her children, if they ask you what you are, just tell them what they see with their eyes, they can't carry off with their noses. Folks is folks, and they all look the same in the privy.
And what would you say? Because you did mention, as you said, that one of her quotes was like, one person plus a typewriter constitutes a movement. As a young adult novel, what are some of the what's the takeaway that you want folks to come away from after reading Pauli Murray's revolutionary life?
Well, I guess just to be audacious about who you would contact to help you or do something that needs to be done. Her friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt started with a letter. I think it was, she wrote her so many, but I think it was about Pauli Murray was trying to get into the University of North Carolina graduate program, and of course they didn't allow Blacks in. And the idea was, well, if there's another school, for Blacks with the same degree, then she'll go to that one. But they didn't actually have a school for sociology, whatever it was, so there was no other school in the area to go to. But so she wanted, I guess, Franklin Roosevelt knew the head of the school, or she wanted him to help with that. So she would write Eleanor Roosevelt to bend the ear of her husband, the president,
Right.
on various issues. And she just wasn't afraid to, she ran for office in Brooklyn one time, and she just was never afraid to step out and try something new, and not afraid to be the first and fight for what she believed in.
Mm. Yeah. So Simki, thank you for getting this book published and allowing people to learn more about Pauli Murray and what she's done. What's the best place to purchase the book if people are interested in getting the book?
Well, I would say, you can get it anywhere, but your favorite indie bookstore is a good start, or straight from Rootstock Publishing. They'll send you one if you order it from them. Barnes and Noble, Books A Million, all of them. There's a hardcover that I didn't even realize they were going to do that, but apparently that's for libraries.
Okay.
So we're hoping that a lot of libraries will find it. Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you very much, Simki. This has been a great experience, and I'm so happy to know that this book is out here, and it's as you say, it's timely. I can't.
Yeah. We didn't get into all her first because that just takes too long. So, but if you look her up, you'll find a whole list of all her firsts.
Wow. Yeah, like you said, there's a lot of firsts that she did. She definitely was a trailblazer. So yeah. So thank you very much, Simki, and look forward to seeing what's coming up next for you too. So
okay, well, maybe I'll get that book of poetry together.
That's right. You got to come back on the show and talk about your poetry. So,
okay.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.